In the previous lesson, what we did was spend some time talking about the nature of the sole trader as a type of business structure. This is part of this aspect of the SQE specification for business law and practice, and it involves an examination of looking at the different types of business and organizational characteristics. This video is going to spend some time talking about the partnership, the next on our list of types of business structures that may exist. That's what is highlighted here in red. Now, ultimately then, the idea of the partnership is actually very similar to that of the sole trader. It is, for example, a form of unincorporated business structure. And for those of you who want to know more, there's a video on looking at the distinction between the incorporated business and the non-incorporated or the unincorporated business. This is essentially how we can delineate, how we can categorize types of business structure. The sole trader is an unincorporated type of business structure. It doesn't go through a process of incorporation. Neither does the partnership, the basic idea of the partnership. You can, in fact, have partnerships that do have the process of incorporation, and we'll get to that in a future video. So fundamentally then, unlike the sole trader, however, there is a distinction, and that distinction involves the fact that a partnership will exist when there are two or more people who run the business. A sole trader, as the name suggests, involves a certain sense of oneness, a certain sense of unitary business operations. You are a sole trader. That does not necessarily mean that you can't take on employees and run a business with other people, but the idea of a partnership is where there are two or more people who come together with the common view to carrying out business operations. And we can see this with the legislation itself. There is some legislation that underpins the regulation of partnerships. The 1890 Partnership Act defines in Section 1 what a partnership in fact may be. And they say that, quote, a partnership is the relation which subsists between persons carrying on a business in common with the view of profit. They then carry on and say that, but in relation between members of any company or association which is registered under the Companies Act 2006, or is formed or incorporated by or in pursuance of any other part or any other act of Parliament or letters or letters parent, for example, like a royal charter, is not a partnership within the meaning of this act. So the point of this is to basically say that a partnership is any relation which subsists between two people carrying on a business with the common view of profit, except for all the other instances that involve that kind of business operation, like a company, for example, that is registered or that is regulated by any act of Parliament that is not this one. So essentially what the Partnership Act does is give you quite a broad definition, in fact, of what a partnership in fact is, and then limits what counts as a partnership within pursuance of the legislation. So the legislation of the Companies Act or royal charters or any other act of Parliament of that nature. Fundamentally then, the unincorporated partnership will in fact act in quite a similar way to that of a sole trader. The only real difference is there has to be at least two persons that are coming together to form this business and to operate the business as a partnership. When the partnership is people, i.e. when it is people who are biological in nature, for example, they will be taxed in the same way as someone who is acting on a sole trader. They will just be taxed separately. They have to fill out their own taxation forms, the self-assessment forms, and then submit those forms to His Majesty's Revenue and Customs, HMRC. So that's essentially how you would pay tax as a sole trader, and that's how you pay tax as a partnership. You essentially register with HM Revenue and Customs and then do a self-assessment form in that way. What about the situations in which partnerships have assets? The point of a business is to make money, is to make profits, and one of the things that happens throughout the course of running a business is that the business starts to accrue assets as well as debts. What about the assets then? The things that you use, the things that have value, that the business is useful for the business, should I say? Well, just like with a sole trader, a partnership doesn't entail the establishment of an entity with separate legal personhood. So there's no sort of separate entity like you would have with a company. The partnership is just the people who are running that business. And so this means that where there are debts owed to a creditor, or where there are assets that are owned by the people who run the business, those debts or those assets will be completely within the ownership of the people who run the business. And so when thinking about debts themselves, the debts will fall directly on the partners, since there's no limited liability, just like they would fall directly on an individual person who is running and operating as a sole trader. The final thing I want to point out in this video is what happens when, or in what circumstances, can partnerships not be people? And I mean people in the biological sense, rather than people in any other kind of sense. So often businesses will run with people, so a normal individual who is running a business, but of course this needn't be the case. One of the interesting quirks of incorporation, the process of creating a separate person in law, is that companies have the ability to be partners. They have personhood in a legal sense, not in a physical sense, but in a legal sense. And so just like ordinary people who are looking to build partnerships, companies can theoretically have that same kind of option. Where this happens, the company may be subject to the same tax requirements as a company would if they were not operating in a partnership, namely corporation tax. And so this has some interesting quirks for taxation purposes. And this is something that we'll get onto in future lessons when we examine tax and the various different business taxes that are associated with business in future videos' time.